It's a great pleasure to be part of this presentation of our book, Galen's Remedies, which came out in April 2026. It's come out at this time partly because much more Galen is made available in the Cambridge Galen translation series. Recently, De Temperamentis and De Sanitate Tuenda were translated. I've done the first part of Simple Medicines, and it seemed a really good time to bring this new Galen, we might say, together with early modern studies and also the Byzantine tradition of Galen, the Arabic tradition of Galen, and the developments in botany, philology, philosophy, and other studies in the early modern period, and also, of course, the arrival of Columbian plants. There are big names in the book, such as Fernell, and there are household names that are not familiar to the normally to the scholarly community. We look at Galen and his influence within the English household. So this is quite an ambitious volume, and we hope you have some questions for us at the end. Next slide, please, Fabrizio. So this is a living tradition. I'm presenting first, and then Fabrizio will follow with the globalization of Galen's Remedies in about 20 minutes' time. Next one, please. So the living tradition of Galen. Next one, please. Now, this interesting image is from a manuscript now in Dresden that is a translation of nearly all of Galen, including Simple Medicines. The edition was made in about 1480, probably in Paris, and it's one of the largest editions of Galen, overtaken only by the Paneth edition in Bologna in 1300. In some ways, this is a better manuscript than the Bologna manuscript because it has 116 illustrations compared with only 57 in the Bologna manuscript. And what's nice about these illustrations, and it shows us how Galen was imagined in Paris in 1480. And you can see here that he's dressed with an ermine hood as a professor of medicine in Paris University. He's addressing his students, and he has various plants hanging up from the shelf. These are his simple medicines, which he's going to describe to us. There are other illustrations that show him directing assistants in which plants to cut. So Galen was using these plants directly. He was interested in how they worked. He was a great authority, but also it's an experimental tradition. He expected every doctor to try out for himself what effects the drug had on the patient. It's not just learned medicine, it's active medicine. Next one, please, Fabrizio. Galen has three kinds of simple medicine. There are plants, there are minerals, there are animals. And in our volume, there's a splendid chapter by Maximilian Haas from Marburg on the scholars Fuchs and Cornarius. And Fuchs in particular was a botanical scholar as well as a philologist. And in the 16th century, he confirms Galen's identifications of plants. This is really important. He is using a new form of botany. Galen was not a botanist. He acquired most of his plant knowledge from his predecessor Dioscorides, but Galen's plant identifications were sufficient for Fuchs in the 16th century. And Maximilian Haas has a website which shows that he believes that we can identify 60% of Galen's plants. So these are not mysterious things. We're not worried about what the Greek name is, what the Latin name is, whether Dioscorides identified the plant correctly. Maximilian reassures us that 60% are identifiable, at least, if not the particular species, at least the family. And what Maximilian has done is really important, just as Susanna Meig did for Theophrastus at the beginning of the 21st century. She was a real botanist, not just a classical scholar sitting in a study like me, who has not seen the plant close up. So there's a very strong botanical tradition that is coming from Galen. And the system in the early modern period, of course, had to add all the additional plants which had come from Asia, and particularly the Columbian plants from South America that were new in Europe. And one of these, guiacum, the lignum vitae, we have a chapter devoted to that in the book. And we also have a chapter devoted to red coral by Francesca Richards. And that's rather nice because Galen refers to red coral in a number of his recipes, in a number of his remedies. He's not all that interested in it. It's not a very familiar thing for him. But it was more familiar in the 16th and 17th century. And Francesca Richards has reviewed how that has been updated in the early modern period. Next slide, please, Fabrizio. If we take a quick look at minerals, enormous and excellent work has been done by a team directed by Effie Photos Jones in Glasgow in recent years. And they are chemists and scientists who are analyzing some of the medicinal minerals that Galen used. In 2023, I think I've got that right. Sorry, 2024, they looked at Lemnian earth. This is a clay from the Greek island of Lemnos, which Galen had visited. He'd visited the sanctuary where the clay was found. This was part of his program to see things firsthand. He visited the copper mines of Cyprus. He visited Lemnos, checked out the clay. And although Effie would say we can't be absolutely sure exactly which earth Galen was talking about, she has come up with a proposal for how it might have worked in an antimicrobial way, obviously unknown to Galen. But the Lemnian earth was still being used in the 19th century in Greece, and there are pills of it surviving in Basel, which Effie and her team have also analysed. So this is part of a living tradition of Galen's simples, we might say. And it's very striking when Galen describes his visits to the copper mines of Cyprus. He talks to the mine manager. He looks at the seams of minerals on either side of the copper deposits. And he also looks at the products of smelting copper, the different products on the floor of the oven than on the roof of the oven. All of these things were important to Galen. He had seen them himself. He'd also, at the same time, traveled to the country of Syrian Palestine. He'd looked at the Dead Sea and worked out why bodies float there, which don't float in the sea, why asphalt is bubbling on the top of bits of asphalt are bubbling on the top of the water, and how this impacts on his patients. So he's an active researcher, and this is what was picked up in the early modern period. I might add that the last 3 books of Simple Medicines, there are 11 books altogether. The last 3 were written 20 years after the first 8, Galen tells us. And part of the delay was caused by these visits to the Eastern Mediterranean doing field work for these minerals, which he had not done for the plants, we might say. Next one, please, Fabrizio. Here again, we are back. Could we go back, please, to the Dresden manuscript? Here he is again in his ermine hood, teaching more students. And this time the subject is animals. There are a number of animal images in the manuscript. And the parts of animals, or some parts of them, were very important as simples. He has a lot to say in the theoretical books about suet and lard, soft and hard fat from different animals, which can be used in plasters, and some of them, such as pig fat, are more neutral than goat fat, Galen tells us. Other things of interest, if we could go on to the next one, Fabrizio, please, on the subject of animal parts, is that he looks at animals very closely in his food treatise. The animals he looks at first for human foods are quadrupeds, then he looks at birds, then he looks at fish, and we might suppose that the quadrupeds were more suitable for the human system than fish, but that is not what Galen thinks. He thinks red mullet has a substance very similar to the substance of human flesh, and it's a very suitable food. And so it has a very mild, if any, drug effect on the human body because it is so similar to the human body. Whereas beef and pork, which may be thought to be more nutritious, at the same time are not as suitable for the human body as red mullet because it kind of unbalance the body. And rebalancing the body is what drugs are all about. The food maintains the body as it is, Galen says, and drugs uses opposites or similars to rebalance the body. And some animal parts, Galen says this is in book 12 of Simple Medicines. Sorry, I don't mean book 12. I'm thinking of the in book 11 of Simple Medicines. Crabs' claws, water crabs, river crabs, when they're burnt, are a remedy for rabies. Galen cannot say how this happens. This is not explained. And this is a problem that I'm coming on to now, and it continues to be a problem into the early modern period. How is it that this drug works? Galen wants to know. He passed it on for later generations to explain. Next one, please, Fabrizio. Right, so looking at Simple Medicines as a whole, Galen wrote it in two parts. There are the theoretical parts, books 1 to 5, which I have translated for the Cambridge Galen translation series. And that is, for me, what is so important about Simple Medicines. Galen was not just presenting us with a catalogue of drugs, a very valuable catalogue which is beyond compare, but he's also explaining how they work. He's explaining the physics and the physiology, which is something that his great predecessor Dioscorides had not done. Dioscorides is the most excellent medical botanist, but he did not say why and how a drug worked. Galen could say that, and what Galen didn't say, the early modern period and the Arabic period did say. So the basic distinction he makes in drug theory is to show how drugs change the body, in contrast with foods which maintain the body. And of course, it would be obvious to everybody listening to this that many simples do both. So we might think of garlic as a food. Galen thinks it's a food of absolutely minimal value, but it's a very strong drug. It has a very pungent flavor. It can cut through thick fluids in the body. So garlic is both a food and a drug, but the food part works differently on the body from the drug part. Food maintains, drugs change the body. How does Galen know this? Well, he has rigorous testing. Every drug must be tested ideally by every doctor. It's no good accepting Galen's word for it. You have to test it for yourself if you are a physician or a herbalist. And your testing must be organized in a proper logical system. It must also be repeatable. It's no good having a one-off result. You have to be able to repeat it, and it must be sustainable over time. It can't just be a flash. And once you have done your testing, you will be able to differentiate between different degrees of heating or cooling, whatever it might be, between different species and similar species. And you'll also be able to differentiate between degrees of action, degrees of effect that the drug has. And because Galen wrote his treatise in two parts, the manuscript tradition is largely divided into two parts. And Alain Touaid, in a chapter in the volume, has shown that throughout the Byzantine period, that is from about 500 AD or a bit earlier, until the 15th century, the Greek world was not really interested so much in Galen's theory. They wanted the practical medicine, they wanted the catalogues. There were over 50 Greek manuscripts which contain the catalogue. Only 5 has survived of the theory. The Byzantine tradition is an active tradition by doctors who are giving these simples to their patients. In contrast, the Arabic tradition has a stream which is very interested and very active in studying Galen's theory. And as Fabrizio will say, I think, they developed ideas of drug intensity, which Galen had not done. And they also reflected on what was not successful in Galen's presentation. So the Arabs, more than the Greek tradition, showed that Galen was a work in progress. It's not this great unassailable authority. Next slide, please, Fabrizio. So I'll just go over this very briefly, and people can pick up on things that interest them. I've tried to highlight some things here that are really important to Galen. Some of you might think that Galen's really interested in humors. He is interested in humors, but that he would place within therapy rather than drug theory. And in simple medicines, he is looking at elements, because the elements earth, air, fire, and water, because the simples have come from the fish have come from the sea, the plants have come from the earth, the animals have come from creatures who have eaten the plants and are then eaten by human beings. And much more important than the elements are the qualities: hot, dry, hot, cold, wet, and dry. But Galen is a little bit unclear about exactly how qualities work and how elements work. He's working with both of them and doesn't really want to be absolutely explicit and the same in every treatise. And this is because he's writing about medicine. He's not writing about the whole natural world. And he leaves to philosophers questions of how qualities actually relate to elements in the natural world. And that difference between natural philosophy and medicine marks a most important distinction for Galen. He can talk about medicine, he can't talk about the whole cosmos. But of course, in the early modern period, people did want to talk about the whole cosmos, and they wanted to say, well, this is what sulfur is, or excuse me, this is what a dandelion is in the whole natural order. But that was not what Galen was trying to do. So he tends to talk about elemental qualities, which are largely hot, cold, wet, and dry. And his particular focus is capacity. How does a drug act on the body when it is activated by the body? So a capacity is a quality waiting to be activated, and it is activated when in contact with body heat. And this is a key cause of how drugs act on the body. And the drug actions are secondary. They're not those cosmic primary actions of plants and animals and minerals. He's very interested in how a piece of bread, when you eat it, is transformed into blood. How does the body do that? When you have bread, which is a food, the body is being maintained. When you have a drug, the body consumes it and activates it in the same way, but it's going to rebalance, as I said. How does that work? And Galen develops a notion of the whole substance. It's not new to Galen, but he made much of it. And he sees whole substance as the bread changing. That's a change of the whole substance when it changes into blood. A poison changes the whole substance when it takes away the body heat. And most drugs are somewhere between a food and a poison, and they change 2 or 3 qualities within the body. That's how he sees it working. How to know exactly what the components of a drug are or what the capacities are? Well, the senses will tell you. You use your 5 senses when testing, and flavor is the most important. Flavor can tell you better than smell exactly what the impact of the drug is going to be when it's inside the body. Once you've established your data with testing and flavor, then you move to differentiation to distinguish one thing from another, and then you have a formal logical demonstration. Then you have your theory for that particular drug. And there's a splendid book that came out on Galen's epistemology, how Galen made all this work, which came out from CUP from Matthias Havreder and Jim Hankinson. Anybody who wants to know how Galen's theory work, look at Galen's epistemology 2022. Next slide, please, Fabrizio. Right, now, I mentioned whole substance, mostly dealing with foods and poisons, but Galen says some transformations in the body are unknown. We can't know what they are. And this is something which was taken up in a big way in the early modern period. And you can see at the bottom of the slide, Brooke Holmes and Elizabeth Moreau discuss this, especially with reference to Fernel, the French philosopher. And he picked up on what can be known and what can't be known, and what can be refined. And Galen and then Fernel, in a Neoplatonic kind of way, are able to look at the fineness of things. It's things that can't really be detected by the senses, which Fernell picks up on, and other people. And so where Galen had been a bit ambiguous about how elements and qualities might interrelate, and he's not absolutely explicit about what he means by the fine composition of a substance or the thick composition. He's trying to work at the micro level of a substance, but he can't really define it very closely, not having a microscope, of course. But Fernell takes that much further than Galen was able to do. He carries the torch forward, you might say, from Galen. Next slide, please, Fabrizio. And this is where I conclude. The book is looking at Galen both in the study in a very refined way that Fernell does, and then in the home. Zoe Screti, I mentioned, looks at Galen and Paracelsus within domestic medicine. This is how Galen is being received at home. So it's both a high level study of the cosmos. It's also something that's got to work in the domestic, excuse me, the domestic medical cabinet. And also on a more local level than Fernell, Vivian Nutten has looked at Lawrence Grill, the German doctor who died very young, but who wrote a posthumous work in 1536 on how flavors work. So he picked up Galen's fourth book of Simple Medicines, where flavor is the leading criterion for establishing the composition of a drug when testing. He wrote a book on sweet things and a book on sour things. This is pure Galen. Galen thought that most foods were sweet in flavor, and the most important class of drugs were sour or astringent drugs. So Lawrence Grill is a local study of something which continued to be very important in this period. And the final contribution by John Colley, who's a scholar at Cambridge. This is not in our volume, but he's written recently about Thomas Eliot in 16th century England, who was very taken with the translations of Galen by Thomas Linacre, who worked on the first printed edition of the Greek Galen. And Eliot was able to read these translations of Simple Medicines from 1530 and of On Maintaining Health from 1514. And he incorporated them into English thought and English philosophy. This was part of England catching up with Italy and other places in Europe. And it was a matter of learning and distinction as well as medical practice. Galen could provide that also in a non-technical way in the 16th century. Well, I think that's me finished, Fabrizio, so I will hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, John, for introducing and for breaking the ice of our presentation. So let me take over from this. I'm going to discuss about the early modern period. More specifically, I'm going to discuss the dynamics of globalization in terms of how the Galenic tradition, in an extended sense, influenced and was transmitted to East and West. So Galen's pharmacopoeia, that is to say, the set of remedies later known as Galenicals, had become global long before the term itself became as fashionable as increasingly meaningless. For Galen, remedies had to be assessed directly in order to verify not only their quality but also their possible adulteration. Continuous with food in terms of their qualities, though not in the intensity of their effects, drugs were both more precious and more sought after. This encouraged the growth of a thriving black market populated by merchants and quack doctors ready to sell wealthy patrons not only magical potions but, more often, low-quality materials, cheap substitutes, or even poisonous remedies at considerable prices. Countering these practices through the assessment of quality and the supervision of the manufacture of remedies required extensive travel, the purpose of which Galen reports in detail, and I quote, "As I had read in Dioscorides and other authors that the Lemnian earth, terra sigillata, was mixed with goat's blood, and that out of that mixture of blood and mud the priests made what they call Lemnian seals and gave them for selling, I wanted to inspect how this mixture was made and in which proportion. For this reason, as I sailed to Cyprus to inspect the metals that are extracted there, I also went to Syria, the cave part of Palestine, to inspect the extraction of bitumen and similar substances, and so it did not displease me to sail to Lemnos to see how much blood was added to the composition of Lemnian earth." End of quote. The inspection turned out to disqualify Dioscorides' claim. When Galen reported it, the people of Lemnos started laughing. Lemnian earth contained no added blood. Satisfied with its purity, Galen took 20,000 stamped cakes of that medicinal earth back with him in Rome. This account marked the beginning of an extraordinarily wide and influential tradition stretching from the Roman Empire to India, China, South Korea, in Japan in the east, and the Americas in the west. Yet it is a story that has only recently begun to be told. Until some 20 years ago, continuity was regarded as problematic, its global reach was largely unacknowledged, and processes of hybridization were suspected but rarely analyzed. Historians have generally explained the longevity of galenic therapeutics in terms of conservatism or institutional persistence. In what follows, I shall argue instead that its survival resulted from its exceptional capacity for theoretical hybridization. I will first briefly explore the reception of galenic pharmacopoeia in Eastern and Western cultures, and then explain why it became global in the sense of influencing centuries of local traditions. Specifically, I will show that the same features that enabled galenic pharmacopoeia to travel globally also explain its remarkable longevity. In particular, I will organize my talk around three claims. First, that Galen's route to the east was facilitated by the assimilation of his theory of the degrees of drugs. Second, that the route to the west was facilitated by the primarily practical appeal of Galen's pharmacopoeia. Third, that Galen's remedies remained vital until the Industrial Revolution because they complemented chemical remedies in both theory and practice. To trace its global reach, we ought to begin with an outline of the trade routes followed by the Galenicals. Here we can distinguish between two paths, one pre-modern, expanding eastwards, the other one modern after 1492, expanding both westwards and further east, reaching remote places such as Japan. The first path, by means of which galenic drugs lore was integrated into Arabic, Indian, and Chinese medicine, is well known. The transmission into the Arabic-speaking world began with the translation movement of the 8th and 9th century. Greek medical texts were first translated into Syriac and subsequently into Arabic. The most important figure in this process was Unaym ibn Ishaq, 809-873, who produced translations of numerous Galenic works and established a textual basis for their circulation throughout the Abbasid world. During the 9th and 10th centuries, Galenic remedies became integrated into Arabic medical literature, particularly through the works of Al-Razi and Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. Now, take this map with a grain of salt, because I made it myself. It may not be complete, but it serves to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. It was, however, during the 11th to 13th centuries that physicians expanded Galenic materia medica through the addition of substances originating from Persia, Central Asia, India, and the wider Islamic world. Through Muslim migration and conquest during the 12th and 13th century, Galenic remedies reached the Indian subcontinent. Medical texts and practitioners arriving from Persia and Central Asia introduced a body of knowledge derived not only from Galen, but also from Hippocrates, Al-Mazi, and Avicenna. This tradition later became known as Unani medicine, from the Arabic term for Greece, Yunan. Prior to the colonial period, it was simply referred to as Tib. The penetration of Galenic pharmacology into the East was due to a remarkable feature of Galen's system, the doctrine of degrees. This made the system at once rigorous and theoretically pliable. To understand what degrees are in Galen, we must begin with some general outlines of his pathology. The most fundamental principle is that disease and therapy are primarily defined by their intensity, a term that Galen uses megathos, and inversely proportional to one another. The more severe the disease, the more powerful the remedy must be in order to restore the body's equilibrium. Intensity is assessed by the physician at the bedside. Some diseases have barely perceptible symptoms, others are manifest, while others again present strong or extreme manifestations. Galen associated each of these reactions with a degree, so the degree measures the reactions, not the mixture of primary qualities. And the first degree was associated with medicinal foods, the second with mild drugs, the third with strong drugs, and the fourth with poisons and extremely hot or cold substances. The success of this theory lay in the fact that it provided reference points for something that often became visible only when it was too late, the progression of disease. Since the severity of a disease could be assessed only through its symptoms, and the intensity of drugs only through their effects, medical aesthesis, that is, what we would today call the clinical eye, had to be trained to recognize the variations that determine the proper proportion between disease and remedy. Degrees therefore acted as elementary perceptual units that could be detected by the physician and on the patient's body, and at times by the patients themselves. Additionally, each degree provided a criterion for choosing between different remedies. Since all drugs belonging to the same degree were assumed to act in a comparable manner, if one remedy was unavailable, another could be substituted, provided that it belonged to the same degree. It is therefore not difficult to understand why such an approach became widespread. It could easily be extended to foodstuff. It was not confined to regionally sourced remedies, but provided practitioners in different regions with a framework that could be adopted and adapted to locally available ingredients. The second path, leading westwards, begins of course with discoveries of the Americas in 1492. It is especially important because, rather than simply expanding in scope, Galenic pharmacopoeia was enriched with new ingredients. The Colloquios dos Simples by the Portuguese physician Garcia de Horta, 1563, provides an early example of this. Horta lists drugs Galen either did not know or misunderstood in terms of their origin, but relies on his authority for pretty much everything else. The same trend continued with Pietro Andrea Mattioli, who incorporated into the various editions of his Discorsi and Commentari on Dioscorides more than 100 new plants, including a few, like the tomato, from the New World. Tobacco and guaiacum were among the new remedies imported from the West Indies. Their adoption into the standard practice posed a series of theoretical and practical problems. How should new drugs be classified within the Galenic system? According to what criteria? Some drugs did not fit easily within Galen's framework. For instance, cinchona bark, or quinine, introduced into Europe in the 1630s, was classified as hot because of its bitterness, yet it was primarily used against fevers and contradicted the expectation that it should act through humoral evacuation. An easy conclusion to draw from these explanatory difficulties, and one that remains common among historians of medicine, was reached by Erwin Akerknecht in his lectures on the history of therapeutics, where he surmised, and I quote, The second great event in 16th and 17th century therapeutics was the description and importation of so-called exotic drugs like guaiac, tobacco, coca, ipecacuanha, Peru balm, in connection with the discovery of the Western Hemisphere and the maritime route to India. They all undermined Galenism through their very existence, even more than did Paracelsus' cursing, but no more than the Peruvian bark, chincona, a specific which cured omnipresent malaria without any regard to Galenic principles. End of quote. The opposite is probably closer to the truth. As noted, these challenges served as stress tests whose repercussions were more local than structural. Galenists adapted. For instance, Galen had shown that some drugs such as oak gall or safflower, the Cardamus tinctorius L, operated through similarity rather than opposition. They evacuated phlegm because of their phlegmatic nature. So the reduction of all Galenic pharmacopoeia to the principle contraria contraris curantur is a myth. There is space within Galenic system and the Galenic pharmacopoeia for homeopathic remedies. In essence, Galen's rationale for classifying and identifying therapeutic virtues was extremely flexible and survived these stress tests. Most importantly, by the end of the 16th century, the primary mode of action of Galen's drugs was increasingly understood not to operate not through the traditional mixture of qualities and humors, but as taking place through bodily pores, leading to a growing emphasis on the structural and corpuscular features of drugs, and ultimately contributing to the early modern hybridization of Galenism and mechanical philosophy. This hybridization greatly benefited the traditional Galenic rationale. Galen's consideration of a drug's texture, whether thin or thick in composition, played a significant role in facilitating this process. In his magnum opus on simple drugs, in 11 books, and John just recalled it, its structure and its content, Galen argues that the actualization of a drug's powers relies more on texture than on its elemental qualities. He expands on this point by highlighting that texture directly influences the speed of drug action, what Galen calls tacos tes energias. That is to say, the rate at which a drug moves through the bodily pores and channels. Aspects that were central for Galen, such as the capacity to warm or cool the body, were maintained but became derivative of deeper structural changes in the composition of matter. A case in point is provided by the experiments of Johann Jakob Wepfer, 1620–1695, a Swiss physician considered one of the fathers of experimental toxicology. Through the vivisection of animals that had been orally poisoned, he traced lesions in their gastrointestinal tract and attributed them to the presence of sharp particles or spikes concealed in toxic plants such as water hemlock, aconite, and Strychnos nux vomica, as well as in corrosive mineral poisons such as mercuric chloride. Advanced as it was, this corpuscular approach retained a distinctly Galenic flavor, describing these sharp poisons in terms of their effects and according to their hot or warm qualities. Hermann Boerhaave and Carl Linnaeus provide a case in point for later periods, when mechanical philosophy had unquestionably become the dominant framework in natural philosophy. Boerhaave's De Viribus Medicamentorum, first printed in 1723 and then this is a reprint in 1753, were grounded in the most rigorous mechanical principles, still categorizes remedies according to their strength or capacity to produce specific effects, such as evacuating particular humors or soothing pain. And then you have the anodina, the remedia phlegmagoga, cholagoga, hydragoga, and so forth. Only a few decades later, Linnaeus devoted an entire section, section 12, of his Philosophia Botanica to vires, in which he specifies that the intensity of scent can help distinguish poisonous from beneficial plants. He then provides a list of contrary qualities and capacities, qualitates et vires, that help the naturalist identify the effects of plants on the human body. In this revised and hybridized form, Galen's remedies reached as far as Japan. An illustrative example is the Sampo Oten, and I apologize for the pronunciation of this Japanese term, or Canon of the Three Methods, one of the earliest Western pharmacological treatises introduced into Japan. Published in 6 volumes between 1802 and 1813 by the Osaka-based physician Hashimoto Sokishi, 1763-1836, there was a Japanese translation of a Dutch dispensatory, the Pharmacopoeia Galeno-Chemico-Medica by Wouter van Lys. Sokishi based his translation on the first of the work's 2 editions. The first is Rotterdam, 1747. The second was published in Amsterdam in 1764, and is the one you find on the slide. Intended as an update of the much earlier Pharmacopoeia Rotterdamensis Galeno-Chemica, Van Lys' edition also introduced new visual elements. The most notable is perhaps the richly decorated frontispiece, showing Galen seated beside the personification of chemistry, dictating prescriptions. New instruments, such as the thermometer, are paired on the wall with pharmacy jars, while in the background a garden of medicinal plants unfolds as putti handle chemical instruments and medicinal herbs. This kind of visualization and hybridization between chemical remedies and galenic remedies starts in the 17th century, and is represented as a contrast, sometimes as an integration between the garden with the dry specimens and new distillation tools and chemical apparatuses. In light of the foregoing, I wish to conclude by highlighting the structural elements that, beyond mere institutional inertia or professional conservatism, underpin the flexibility of Galen's pharmacopoeia and contributed to its survival. These included terminological clarity and consistency, accessibility, and a focus on locally sourced remedies. Terminological consistency, which underpinned the systematic classification and continuous updating of materia medica, played a major role. By incorporating specimens from the Mediterranean, the Indies, and the New World, Galen's system provided a synthesis that facilitated the identification of samples and their standardization under therapeutic rubrics, which eventually evolved into independent botanical classifications. We have seen this process at work in the doctrine of the degrees of drugs, but a much broader pharmacopoeia had developed in the meantime, prompting the rediscovery and proper classification of Galen's and Dioscorides samples. Another significant factor was accessibility, by which I mean conceptual, linguistic, practical, and social accessibility, which helped maintain the popularity of galenic remedies across different social strata. Paracelsian chemistry was cloaked in riddles. Mechanical philosophy was rooted in the belief that the wood functioned as a clockwork mechanism. Galen's medicine had neither characteristic. The core principles of Galen's pharmacopoeia provided a kind of pre-theoretical framework for organizing sensory experience. Warm or cold reactions to a remedy could be assessed immediately and directly by both physician and patient, and then conceptualized in terms of strength and degree. In contrast to the esoteric jargon of the iatrochemists or the theoretical speculations of iatromechanists, these principles were expressed through a clear vocabulary, elegantly organized around the binary opposition between simple and compound remedies. Additionally, the reliance on locally sourced materia medica and the capacity to incorporate indigenous remedies made galenicals comparatively easier to prepare and to integrate into household medicine, which in turn increased the demand for apothecaries to supply them. And in the book, we have a very good chapter by Pablo Alcover Caceura, who explains how the mechanism works. And we also have, of course, as John explained a few moments earlier, other chapters, including Francesca Richards. So let me highlight some conclusions. In essence, while local in focus, galenic pharmacopoeia was global in scope. By the time the European crops and remedies made their way into the Spanish colonies of South America, as Paula de Vos has shown, galenic pharmacopoeia had already undergone a process of commodification. Substances were not merely used for healing, but had become part of a global trade network intertwined with agricultural expansion and colonial power dynamics. Adding to this picture, travelers and colonizers also imported apothecary regulations and rules for the preparation of remedies in a process whereby a tradition expanded by incorporating new practices and methods that did not contradict its core principles. As we have seen, this expansion occurred chiefly through hybridization, the selective incorporation into traditional Galenism of elements derived from different theoretical traditions. However, while its global reach cemented the long-standing success of Galen's pharmacopoeia, its very flexibility also contributed to its decline. The gradual infiltration of chemical and corpuscularian theories into the Galenic framework diminished its explanatory power, shifting emphasis towards individual remedies and their specific effects. This practicalization of Galenicals, together with the widespread artisanal adoption that had ensured their success, was among the major forces driving their eventual decline. The final blow to this distinctively artisanal tradition of Galenicals was struck by the emergence of scientific chemistry, which enabled by 1850 the large-scale industrial preparation of remedies, radically transforming the conditions of pharmaceutical production. In this sense, Galenicals were not superseded by a paradigm shift, but by a new mode of production. This new mode of production also transformed the role of medicine and of the human body as mediating factors in the process of healing. It invites serious reflection. Galenic pharmacopoeia remains centered on the Hippocratic idea that the physician assists nature in healing itself and the drugs operate in conjunction with the body's own capacity. This requires time as the essential mediator. Chemical and industrial medicine increasingly shifted attention towards the active properties of individual substances, their precise dosage, and their standardized administration. Galen aimed at medicinal therapy. We strive for scientific pharmacology and fast-acting remedies. In a sense, much of modern naturopathy seeks to recover time as an essential mediator of therapy. Yet how this aspiration can be reconciled with the pace and demands of modern life remains an open question. That question must be addressed elsewhere, but the history of Galenic remedies may have considerably more to contribute to its answer than we have generally been inclined to assume. Thank you.